Today we're going to be discussing imperialism, blowback, and the struggle for liberation from 9/11 to 10/7. We'll be looking at a comparison between 9/11 and 10/7, looking at some of the events that led up to it, some of the repercussions that came afterwards or that we continue to see today. We'll also take a look at everything through a Marxist lens near the end, doing a comparison between the two. I want to start the presentation, though, with a quote from Frantz Fanon. The native knows that he is not an animal, and it's precisely at the moment he realizes his humanity that he begins to sharpen the weapons with which he will secure its victory. This, of course, is in relation to minority groups, especially here in the US, that are continually treated like animals. We can see that with the indigenous people when the U.S. when we first came to the U.S. and started colonizing the indigenous people. Also, the same sentiment that the Nazis gave to the Jews in Germany. I think that this is very important to understanding the whole context of what we're talking about today. So many of us are aware of the events that transpired on 9/11. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to give a high-level overview. The World Trade Center, also known as the Twin Towers, was an office space used by about 35,000 people, 430 companies. It stood over 1,300 feet tall, 1,700 if you count the antenna. That's a lot taller than I thought it was. Before 9/11, the World Trade Center was targeted by another terror, 1983, that killed 6 and injured thousands. On 9/11/2001, 19 Al-Qaeda members hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and deliberately crashed 2 of them into the Twin Towers and 1 into the Pentagon. The 4th plane, Flight 93, fought back against the Al-Qaeda members and led the plane to crash in an empty field in Pennsylvania, missing its intended target, the White House, just 20 miles away. There were many casualties that day, and even more would follow due to exposure from toxic chemicals that covered a large area around the attack. Around 3,000 people were killed during the attack on 9/11, but according to a USA Today article from 2018, more than 2,000 additional deaths were reported from diseases related to 9/11. Also, nearly 10,000 people have been diagnosed with cancer, contributing it to toxic debris that coated offices, cars, and homes. To no one's surprise, the attack on 9/11 had been broadly denounced, calling out the senseless killing of civilians. There's more to get into here from a Marxist and anti-imperialist point of view, but we'll get deeper into that later. Our mainstream media helped to stoke the coals of nationalism after the attack. All across the country, Americans banded together, taking pride in the U.S. empire's resilience. The U.S. government would use 9/11 as an excuse to lead a slaughter across the Middle East, killing not thousands, but tens of thousands. Again, many of these casualties were non-combatants, women and children. Spoilers, you're going to hear this a lot during this presentation. The wave of reactionary Islamophobia pulled people away from anti-imperialism, people that were already and continue to be hurt by US imperialism, instead of winning them over to the fight against imperialism. However, some anti-war activists, like the ISO, raised competing slogans at the time, such as "Don't turn tragedy into war," blaming the US's meddling in the Middle East and Afghanistan. But the question a lot of us should be asking, and not accept the surface level explanations such as "they just hate us," as to why the attack happened. This question takes us back to 1978 Afghanistan, following the rise of the pro-Soviet, also a Marxist-Leninist group, called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. As the PDPA attempted to install social reform, they had little support from rural areas, which actually led to armed conflicts across the region. The US, ever being an opportunist and vehemently opposed communism, began to funnel money towards opponents of the PDPA. Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor at the time, gave this warning in response. It was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. That very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that my opinion, this aid was going to induce Soviet military intervention. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. With the country on the brink of civil war, the Soviet Union sent troops to late 1979. Soviet Union sent troops in late 1979 to prop up friendly governments along the border. On this same day, Brzezinski wrote a letter to Carter saying, "We now have the opportunity to give the USSR its own Vietnam." The Soviet occupation lasted more than 9 years. During this time, more than 1 million Afghans were killed during attacks. The Soviets were never able to defeat the rebels that emerged under the name of the Mujahideen. The Soviet occupation lasted for over 9 years. Over 1 million Afghans were killed during this time. Oh, I'm sorry, I just read that. They also received billions of dollars of aid from Washington, from Carter and Reagan under their separate terms. The CIA encouraged tens of thousands of Islamic radicals to travel to Afghanistan and fight the Soviets, all at taxpayer expense. This was a desperate continuation of the Cold War, which effectively put a large financial burden on the Soviets in Moscow, who would withdraw from Afghanistan in 1989 and later collapse in 1991. While the US succeeded in its goal to defeat the Soviets, they left Afghanistan in a broken state as warring factions turned Kabul into a battleground. This eventually led to the creation of a network of Islamic radicals. Among the first members of this network was a civil engineer and businessman from a wealthy Saudi family. You may recognize him under the name of Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden recruited 4,000 people from his own country and grew close relations with members of the Mujahideen. He also worked alongside the CIA, collecting money from private citizens. By 1988, these radical groups had spread across 26 different countries. The US was not unaware of this, but they assumed that this did not pose a threat to the US. In contrast with the US's expectation, these radicals were responsible for attacks in the Philippines, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, France, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, China, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and even included US targets. US diplomat to Pakistan, Abu Jamal, called this an instance of the chickens coming home to roost. You can't plug billions of dollars into an anti-communist jihad except participation from all over the world and ignore consequences. But we did. The CIA began to call this phenomenon blowback. Moving ahead to 2001, George Bush's administration was salivating over any excuse to invade Afghanistan. Insider reports and journalists from the Washington Post revealed that the administration had banded together to overthrow the government of Saddam Hussein, who served as president of Iraq for nearly 20 years prior. But they felt they couldn't get away with an outright assault on Iraq. It just seemed one step too far, a little too extreme. So the plan became to build a coalition to invade Afghanistan as a stepping stone to attack Iraq later. By April of 2001, Bush had formed an advisory panel of big energy and oil companies, which released a report warning the US would face extreme energy price volatility, stating in the report, the United States remains a prisoner of its own energy dilemma. Iraq remains a destabilizing influence to the flow of oil to international markets from the Middle East. Saddam Hussein has also demonstrated a willingness to threaten to use the oil weapon and to use his own export program to manipulate oil markets. Therefore, the US should conduct an immediate policy review towards Iraq, including military, energy, economic, and political diplomatic assessments. The next month, another report was released reinforcing the idea that the US was very dependent on imported oil, and it may become necessary to overthrow foreign resistance to secure access. Political scientist Michael Clare summed it up pretty well when he said American efforts to obtain increased supplies of foreign oil will require more trade deals and diplomacy. It will also require the threat or the use of force to dissuade hostile forces from attempting to obstruct the flow of petroleum to the United States. This, in turn, will require an enhanced U.S. capacity to operate militarily in areas of likely fighting over oil. And while these efforts may have been accelerated since September 11th, it is important to note that they began well before. The US expected that conflict with Iraq would disrupt production and cause spikes in the price of oil, but they expected it to be temporary. If the US could install a puppet regime in Baghdad, they hoped that within a few years, they would have an abundant supply of cheap oil. But it wasn't all about securing its own future needs. Europe, Japan, and China were far more dependent on the Middle Eastern oil than the US. A military occupation of Iraq would give more leverage over its rivals. US control would also undermine the power of the OPEC cartel, which had been a long goal of US foreign policy. With struggles of energy and oil aside, there were still more motives. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the US remained the only world superpower at the time. In September 2000, a PNAC document outlined a strategy of maintaining global US preemptive order in line with American principles and interests. This, of course, included overwhelming military force to take over the Gulf region. The report also noted that to implement such aggressive policies, some catastrophic and cataclysmic event like Pearl Harbor would need to happen. From that perspective, the 9/11 attacks offered the Bush administration the opportunity it already wanted to pursue. After 9/11, the US established military presences in Afghanistan, the former Soviet Union, and all across Central Asia to hold its dominance in its pursuit for oil and power. Strategically, this was an attempt to create a military vice grip around the Caspian Basin, a critical source of natural resources, especially gas. This expansion could ideally provide a buffer between Russia and China. But we see now, about 20 years later, that the US is far from keeping Russia and China in check and remains rivals to the US on the global economy. Additionally, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have trapped the US in a quagmire of ongoing conflict. The US had occupied Afghanistan for nearly 20 years before they completed their withdrawal on August 31st of 2021. This left the country in the hands of the Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. Just weeks earlier, Joe Biden, our current president, said there were no significant parallels between the US withdrawal of Afghanistan and the US final withdrawal of Vietnam, saying the likelihood there's going to be a Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is unlikely. Good one, Joe. A recent report from the Cost of War Project estimated that between 897,000 and 929,000 people have been killed as a result of the US's war on terror, with the majority of them being from Afghanistan and Iraq. At least 387,000 of those were civilians, the majority of them women and children, again, non-combatants. Other estimates put this number even higher, with a total cost of $8 trillion. The US government had admitted from its own point of view that these ventures have left the US weaker, not stronger. Biden's decision to withdraw troops from the Middle East was that they were no longer serving US interest. This, of course, led to the collapse of the Ashraf Ghani government, where again it fell into the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In a speech at the end of August, Biden claimed that the US government had learned its lessons of Afghanistan. Really, it had learned absolutely nothing. The withdrawal from Afghanistan represents not the end of US imperialism, but simply a new phase in which the administration intends to prioritize greater competition with Russia and China. But American officials are reworking plans to counter threats that could emerge from Afghanistan's chaos. According to current and former officials, negotiating for new bases in Central Asian countries, determining how clandestine officers can run sources in the country without the military and diplomatic outposts that provide cover to spies for 2 decades, and figuring out where the CIA could launch drone strikes and other Afghanistan operations. In the early 1900s, the US was at its peak of its power and wealth. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States could have easily used its immense wealth and resources to not only improve the lives of its citizens, it could have improved the lives of people around the world, addressing major international conflicts. The power, the influence, the resources were all there, yet the US chose violence and dominance. But this alternate reality would require more than just better, more moral participants in seats of power. It would require the creation of a new economic system that prioritizes human need and environmental sustainability. The current system that futilely chases endless profit at the expense of everyone that lives on this planet, what motive does someone have to attack you if you call them friend to help them improve their lives? But no, instead, the US did the opposite. On October 7th, many people, many of which were allegedly part of Hamas, the current ruling political party in Palestine, led an attack on Israel. While there are mixed reports about that day, no thanks to Israel's propaganda machine and most mainstream media outlets having close ties to the Israeli government, it's assessed that 1,200 people were killed that day during the attack. Though I will also take this chance to mention the reports of IOF soldiers attacking their own citizens, and even the Israeli government is said to have ignored documented plans from Hamas in regards to this attack. The attack on the colonial state of Israel is the result of almost 80 years of apartheid and violence from Israel. This had been met with mostly peaceful protests from the against the occupational forces. Protesters would throw rocks, soldiers would retaliate with flurries of bullets. It isn't just the IOF that secure colonial efforts in Israel, however. Also the citizens of Israel that contribute to its authoritarian violence. Israel would not be able to conduct the atrocities it carries out today if it did not have the backing of a majority of its citizens, which actively, sometimes joyfully, participate in removing Palestinians from their homes or killing them outright. The colonial violence of Israel, the taxpayer money they receive from the US, all benefit Israeli citizens, and we cannot expect that they will ever come around to any kind of land-back resolution for the Palestinian people. Just like their old bastard brother, Israel has used the events of October 7 as an excuse to finish the job, according to Netanyahu. Bombing citizens in Gaza, expelling people from the West Bank. As of today, more than 40,000 people are reported dead in just Gaza alone. Each day, the number gets higher with within 24 hours, there has been another attack claiming another dozen lives. I want to strongly emphasize that the leaders in Gaza have expressed difficulties with accumulating an accurate death toll due to the continuous, relentless attacks, not being able to count or verify the people missing under collapsed cities. Not to mention the thousands that are under the continued threat of famine and disease due to not having roads, stores, or hospitals, all while they navigate from one alleged safe area to another, facing colonial violence the entire way. Similar to the people of the US presently suffering from the health conditions from the fallout of 9/11, the Palestinian people will continue to face complications moving forward. Even if a Palestinian liberation were to take place today, the people of Gaza would face years, possibly decades, to fully recover. Today, Reuters released an article stating that it could take nearly 15 years to just clear the rubble. I would add it would take decades longer for the Palestinian people to heal. Buildings are easily rebuilt. People's lives are not. While to many of us on this call, the call for solidarity towards Palestinian liberation is a no-brainer. Organizations like the Denver Communists and Firebrand defend the Palestinians' right to resist by any means necessary. Still, there are other so-called socialists that would discourage Israel bombing Gaza, but at the same time condemn the attacks of Hamas on October 7th, comparing the senseless killing to the US citizens of 9/11. They may think that this is a supportive stance for people facing a genocide, but all these arguments do is capitulate to the Israeli justification for continuing their attacks. This opposition towards the attacks on October 7th is a massive step back from the leftist response to 9/11. Whereas leftists condemned the attack on 9/11, there was little to no critique or condemnation from the left towards the terrorist groups that committed the attacks on 9/11. And instead, we only saw organized efforts to condemn racism, Islamophobia, and imperialism. These are good things, but we also see that this is misguided, as the attackers on 9/11 were right-wing extremists, not aligned with any sort of liberation. The attack on October 7th were part of a 75-year national liberation struggle by Palestinians. The political result of October 7th have been very different from the results of 9/11. The later shifted national and international opinion in a pro-imperialist direction. October 7th, instead, has provoked the largest international movement for Palestinian liberation since 1948. People across the world understand why Palestinians had to attack Israel. In spite of moralist hand-wringing, the majority of young people in the US support the Palestinian attack on Israel. Israel is more isolated than ever before. The lessons to learn here is that even when the left opposes a particular tactic as counterproductive or even immoral, it needs to keep the focus where it belongs. The left must first of all denounce capitalism and imperialism as the ultimate cause of even misguided actions. It should not play into the hands of the state by seeming to justify repression of the terrorist. The left should know Lenin's attitude to the fight of oppression. The left should know Lenin's attitude to the fight of oppressed nations against imperialism. Lenin said, if tomorrow Morocco was to declare war on France, India, or England, Persia or China, on Russia, and so forth, those would be just defensive wars, irrespective of who attacked first. And every socialist would sympathize with the victory of the oppressed, dependent, and unequal states against the oppressing, slave-owning, predatory great powers. The left does not have to agree with the united political goals of Hamas, but it should want the Palestinians to defeat Zionism, unconditional support to Palestinian liberation, and unconditional opposition to Zionism and imperialism in every form it takes.